I'm the president and CEO for the Columbus Council on World Affairs. It's a pleasure to have you all here as we talk about a really important issue in the world and in our own local community, as a matter of fact. Feeding over 9 billion people by 2050. It's a big order. And what's our role in that? And what should we be doing as individual citizens and as a government? Please join me, though, in thanking today's lead sponsor, the Ohio Soybean Council. We have Kirk Merritt here, Steve Reinhardt, Tom Fontana. Please raise your hand so that we can acknowledge your support for today. Representing today's sponsor is Steve Reinhardt. He's the vice chairman for the Ohio Soybean Council, and he has the distinct pleasure to introduce today's two speakers. Please join me in welcoming Steve to the podium.
Thank you, Patrick, for your kind introduction to the Ohio Soybean Council, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. The Ohio Soybean Council is delighted to be a sponsor of today's program, as this topic is very passionate to us. The Ohio Soybean Council invests in research, marketing, promotion, and education, all designed to maximize the profitability of Ohio soybean farmers. We have developed a robust educational program called Grow Next Gen that uses agriculture to help students learn STEM concepts. Grow Next Gen highlights the wide range of career opportunities available in global agriculture to meet the demand of food over the next 25 years. We are very pleased to partner with the Columbus Council on World Affairs in creating educational opportunities for today's Ohio teachers and students to learn more about the global components of our very international soybean industry. Many people don't know that more than half of Ohio's soybeans are exported to China, Japan, Mexico, Indonesia, and other markets around the world. I am honored to introduce today's two distinguished speakers. Our first panelist is Mr. Phil Karsting, Administrator, United States Department of Agriculture's Foreign Ag Service. Administrator Karsting was appointed to Administrator of the United States Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service in May of 2013. He previously served more than 22 years on Capitol Hill, most recently as Chief of Staff to Senator Herb Kohl, then Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee's Subcommittee on Agriculture, Rural Development, and Related Agencies. Mr. Karsting's previous Capitol Hill assignments included serving as senior analyst to the staff of the Senate Budget Committee, where he handled issues relating to agriculture, rural development, housing, telecommunications, energy, and the environment. He also served as legislative assistant to late Senator Jim Exxon and as a member of the Senate Bipartisan Chiefs of Staff Steering Committee. Concurrent with his duties, Mr. Karsting serves as vice chairman of the Commodity Creditor Corporation and chairs the USDA's Interagency Coordinating Committee on International Agriculture. He also serves as an advisor to the USDA's Task Force on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And Minister Karsting began his association with American agriculture working on his family's farm supply business in rural Nebraska. He received his bachelor's degree in agriculture economics from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he also graduated. He is also a graduate of the International Culinary Center in New York. Our second panelist also comes from Washington, D.C., Ms. Kimberly Flowers. Ms. Kimberly Flowers is the director of the Center for Strategic International Studies Global Food Security Project. The project examines and highlights the impact of food security on U.S. strategic global interests. The project evaluates our current efforts and provides long-term strategic guidance to policymakers to ensure that U.S. foreign assistance programs are efficient, effective, and sustainable. Prior to joining CSIS in 2015, Ms. Flowers was the communications director for FinTrack, an international development company focusing on hunger eradication and poverty alleviation through agricultural solutions. From 2005 to 2011, she worked for the U.S. Agency on International Development, serving overseas as Development Outreach and Communications Officer in Ethiopia and Jamaica, and supporting public affairs in Haiti directly after the 2010 earthquake. Ms. Flowers also led strategic communications for the U.S. government's Global Hunger and Nutrition Initiative, Feed the Future. Ms. Flowers began her international development career in 1999 as a Peace Corps volunteer in Bulgaria, where she founded a young women's leadership camp that continues today. She is a magna cum laude graduate of the William Jewell College, studied at Oxford University, and is alumna of the Pryor Center for Leadership Development. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Administrator Phil Karstings and Ms. Flowers to the stage.
Thank you, Steve. While our friends here get mic'd up, think about your tough questions so that we can stump them. If it has to do with politics, since they're from D.C., we can start with those. But I noticed we have, I was driving Ms. Flowers to Columbus North International High School today through campus, and I said, she was telling me she grew up in Oklahoma, so I said, well, this is the OSU. I know you know another one, but this is the one here, and welcome to a Cornhusker as well. So let me start off, and then I'll get mic'd up here, Administrator Karsting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what, when you think about the U.S. government, when you think about global food security, where do we see that as a role of the U.S. government?
Well,
Can you start? You bet.
First, I just want to say it's really good to be in Columbus, and I didn't realize I was sitting next to magna cum laude. I was on the 4.5-year plan at the University of Nebraska, but not because I was dim, it's because you got 5 season football tickets that way. And I do have great respect for the Buckeyes.
We have football in common.
Okay, well, good. I run something called the Foreign Agricultural Service, and that is the USDA's principal foreign affairs agency. And we concentrate on 3 things. We do trade policy. That means we work with groups like the United States Trade Representative's Office in negotiating trade agreements like the recently finalized Trans-Pacific Partnership. We do trade promotion. Once we have access in a market, we try to amplify a demand for U.S. agricultural products overseas. And third, we do capacity building and development, and helping producers and people in poor countries learn to feed themselves, helping them become perhaps future customers of ours, and helping create a global trade system that makes sense that we will all benefit from. We do that with about 1,300 employees. We have 150 foreign service officers stationed in about 97 offices around the globe. We have 350 locally engaged staff overseas that work for the FAS. Those are the Japanese that work for us in Tokyo and the Brazilians that work for us in Sao Paulo and so forth. Altogether, we're about 1,300 folks. We do a lot of cooperation with USAID to further the goals of food security and efficient global trading systems. So,
great, thank you. That's an
elevator speech.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Ms. Flowers, or may I call you Kimberly and Phil? We've had some time together, so I know they're. In fact, Phil or Administrator Karsting, before we sat down to lunch, you may, if you were here early, you would have seen him on the high wire unicycle outside at COSI. So
when in Rome.
When in Rome. These two get their hands dirty. Kimberly, if you could help, for those of us that don't know the issue very well, what are we talking about here? This food insecurity, this hunger, 2050, 9 billion. What are we looking at?
Sure. Well, I think we have to start by defining what is global food security. There's a lot of misunderstanding of even what that means. When I think of global food security, I think of 4 main elements. It's access to food, but beyond just access, it's access to safe, affordable, and nutritious food. So global food security is about the number of people that don't have access to safe, affordable, and nutritious food. And right now, there's 795 million people in the world that don't have enough daily calories to eat. And when we think about global food security, although I'm very interested in, of course, the extreme hunger and poverty element of it, but it's also how it ties back to U.S. strategic interests. So hunger is, of course, a moral imperative that we want to address, but it's also deeply tied to economic growth, to national security when you think about political stability. Also, of course, as Phil talked about, trade. There's a lot of different components of why addressing food security issues is important to our own interest as well. And so I think there's a lot of different elements of why we should be looking at this.
Okay, and tell us a little bit more about why CSIS has taken global food security as a focus area for its 2016 agenda.
Sure. I think it started back the same time that the U.S. government and the international community had some renewed interest in why food security was so important, and that goes back to national security. So 2007 and 2008, we saw some huge spikes in food prices of dietary staples. And what happened then, where there were about 60 riots in the world around food prices or food price spikes. And so people started to realize the true linkages between food insecurity and, again, political stability. And that sparked definitely renewed interest in funding and awareness and why this should be an important thing to look at. So the U.S. government, through President Obama, has now invested $5 billion in the last 5 years of your tax dollars, focusing in specifically on 19 countries that met a certain criteria of trying to reduce poverty and reduce stunting through agricultural development and a whole of government effort. And CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has been looking at food security since about 2008, but it wasn't until just last year when they brought me on that we now have a full dedicated team looking at this, and we're the only think tank in Washington, D.C. That has a specific research stream on food security, and it's because that our government and the international community is really waking up and realizing the importance of this and how it links with so many other elements of foreign affairs.
Got it. Great. Thank you. When I was thinking about the issue and food security and hunger, and basically part of it's about people not having enough to eat. And so I was thinking about, well, what's the basics here? If I were trying to explain this to myself or an elementary school kid, is how do you change that? You either grow more or help the person grow more, or you give it to them, or you sell it to them. Or you do some other things, which we'll talk about here. But let's start with that first angle of getting more food to the areas where they need it through trade. Let's start with trade. Can you talk about that, Phil, and the role of trade in the global food security issue?
The importance of this in a strategic sense, I think, was made clear, I think, to everybody. The Director of National Intelligence just issued a report last September talking about where global food security, things to keep an eye on, and how that affects our national security. And so I would commend that D&I report to anybody who wants to read it. I tend to think of global food security solutions, if you will, as falling into a handful of baskets. There's obviously the critically important work of development work, and that's where AID and USDA goes and tries to help cultivate local capacity for food production. The other thing that we're focused on is reducing food loss and food waste around the globe. The Secretary is committed to reduce food loss in the United States by a significant amount, and it's also a conversation that's happening at the United Nations, at the Food and Ag Organization in Rome, trying to get people around the globe to understand the importance, and that's one part of the solution. But we would also...
Can you explain like food loss or food waste?
Food loss and food waste? Sure. I mean, there's an enormous amount of calories that go to waste around the globe. Here in industrialized countries, a lot of that happens on food waste, stuff that stays on the plate, stuff that gets thrown away at the grocery store because it doesn't look pretty enough, those kinds of things. In the developing world, a lot more of the challenge is food loss from where it's produced. It either has grains that get infested with insects, or there's an inadequate cold chain management, all kinds of things. So the issues are different depending on the environment in which you're operating, but there is some real meaningful opportunity for addressing global food security by addressing food loss and food waste. The third part that we emphasize a lot at USDA is the role that trade plays in global food security. We've got this Trans-Pacific Partnership that has been, the negotiations have been finalized. It's moving now. I'm going to spend part of the afternoon with the Ohio Farm Bureau talking about that as well. But I like to remind people, if we could get a certain amount of efficiency out of development and a certain amount out of foodways and a certain amount out of efficient trading systems that work, you could make a really meaningful improvement in global food security. I like to point to the example, and I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but if you imagine you're in a country that has an incredibly high tariff rate on nitrogen fertilizer, a 10% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer, 10% cost might increase its utilization by 20%, increase food production by 50%. So we need to think broadly and creatively about how do we leverage improvements in all of these areas to address global food security.
Got it. So if tariffs are reduced through a treaty or trade deals, it becomes less expensive for a local farmer to use fertilizer or
right.
Got it.
Right.
Got it.
Or for a local business to import something and use it as a value added in another venture. We export an enormous amount of tree nuts in this country that get turned into marzipan in Europe or go into other products overseas, and so.
Okay, great. And thinking of the other side of this, Kimberly, and creating increased supply locally and production, can you talk a little bit about agricultural production as a potential avenue for helping solve this?
Sure. Well, the numbers range when we talk about how we're going to feed this amount of people, whether it's 9 or 10 billion by 2050. Many say that we need to increase agricultural production by about 60%. And there's a lot of, so that's a really big problem. There's a lot of big solutions for that. Some of it is, again, as Phil mentioned, the food loss and food waste is about 1/3 is lost globally. So that's part of it. The other part is better inputs, better seeds that can increase yields, farmers not using the same seeds over and over. It's about good agricultural practices that are simple and basic in the developing world. So that's about spacing your crops right, using raised beds, using fertilizers, thinking about soil. Irrigation is a huge issue. Water scarcity is going to continue to, I think, be a severe problem, not just in agricultural production, but I think future wars are going to be fought over natural resources like water and food. So thinking about how we can better use irrigation and use water to increase productivity. I also think it goes back to engaging the private sector. It's about engaging women. Women farmers are a majority of farmers, a lot of smallholders, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So if we could make sure that women have the same access to whether it's finances or, again, inputs and some of these other things, we could feed up to 150 million more people. There's a lot of statistics and studies that show that when a woman farmer has the same access as a man, she actually produces 20 to 30% more. A lot of it's around innovative technology. So beyond inputs and seeds, it's also about using mobile technology so they can have the right kind of information around pricing or markets. It's also linking them up to engage the private sector, but opening up markets. That's getting into policies and enabling environments as well, but figuring out how we can link smallholder farmers to larger markets and going back to regional and trade so that we are doing distribution better and keeping a sustainable model. So lots of big solutions, but it really takes a concerted effort. There also, we could talk about climate change. You've got some, what's happening in the world today, and particularly this year with El Nino, is changing and making dramatic weather patterns shift. And as farmers that depend on rainfall in order for their livelihood, we've got to do better when it comes to climate change mitigation and climate change efforts because that is having a dramatic effect on our agricultural systems as well.
That's interesting. Is there any, go ahead, were you going to mention?
Kimberly, you wrapped in a whole bunch of stuff for students that are out there that are thinking about what would be my role in this in the future. And there are a lot of different angles from which you can contribute to global food security, whether it's working on land tenure issues or legal or public policy issues, the technology piece of it. We see people doing some incredible things with cell phone technology across the globe. Bono does a good TED talk about how once people learn something, they can't unlearn it. And what might that mean for agricultural systems if a producer in sub-Saharan Africa actually has relevant price information and they can make good decisions? That's the sort of stuff that's going to get beamed out over cell phone lines. So the issue of global food security reaches into so many different sectors that it's going to take, I think, a concerted effort by people with expertise in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think about all the engineers and logistics and supply chain people that need to figure out how to get things from A to Z or from different places. Does the issue of you talked about climate change and I was thinking about water as well. But first to climate change, are there any examples you can point to help us kind of see where climate change has had an impact on the local agricultural way of life? Did any jump out at you? Or what are the ones that are forecasted to hit?
I think a lot of people, I mean, there's tons of forecasts out there, and where growing zones are going to change, what's going to happen to pest infestations. I mean, it's going to be a process that plays out over a long period of time, which, to my way of thinking, just requires us to be as incredibly agile in our agriculture framework as possible. That means exploiting new technologies. That means making sure that we have resilience everywhere we can, that we are able to respond so we don't end up with civil crises that will presumably come from some of these global climate change challenges.
And I would just add to that, especially for students out there, and I love that we're doing this live for all the students. Hello, hope you're taking notes. One thing to write down is FEWSNET. It's spelled FEWSNET, and FEWSNET stands for Famine Early Warning System, but it's using satellite technologies and other predictors to try to track weather patterns and other issues to see where the hot spots are, and that's encompassed to also political issues and safety and security concerns. But that's really, it's progressed a lot in the last few years. It's been around for 30 years, but the analysis that it can provide allows us to better understand where there might be famine or extreme crisis, and looking again at weather patterns and seeing how El Nino is creating a massive drought right now in Ethiopia and other areas of East Africa. So the climate change, I mean, not that we don't feel the effects, because I think that's something everyone can start to relate to, of how warm even this winter has been, but it's affecting most smallholder farmers in developing countries, and they have to come up with creative low-cost ways of how to mitigate that. But when your whole livelihood is based on your small plot of land, and then everything is, you have absolutely no water to grow that, it really takes a huge detrimental toll on your family and your community.
Got it. By the way, I'm taking notes on some of the resources you mentioned so that when we do our follow-up email, we'll make sure to include it for those who are listening here. You know, I'm thinking about Syria, and I'm thinking about conflict, and I learned a new word today at the high school. And when we were talking about security, you know, people are hungry, they get mad, and they do things and act out, and the assistant principal said, yeah, that's called hangry. You're hungry and angry mixed together, and you sort of laugh, but take it to the global sphere, and you know, that's not a bad you know, illustration of an issue around global food security. So maybe Kimberly, you could start with that and talk about conflict as you actually in one of your pieces said food insecurity is both a consequence and a driver of conflict. Yeah. Maybe you could talk about that.
Sure. So food insecurity, it's directly related, as I've mentioned. I'm going to keep repeating this to national security and political stability, but it's both a driver when, like I talked about the riots before, so if people don't have access to affordable and safe, nutritious food, they're more likely to act out. But it's also used as a weapon of war. So you see, I mean, famine is only man-made, right? So you see political institutions and dictators or other governments starving out populations as a part of a war tactic. You see terrorist groups, Boko Haram in Nigeria and others in Syria, that are using food as a recruitment tool to get young men to come into their ranks. And again, if you're hangry, you're more likely to be susceptible to those sorts of things. And time again, we see how food systems are completely decimated when you have conflict. And add to that, right now, you have more displaced persons than ever before. You have 60 million people that are displaced by war and conflict. So places like Syria, right now there's 10 million people in Syria who don't have enough to eat. And what's happening within, I mean, last year it was at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, did a study. We're trying to look at what kind of, you know, has happened to the system in Syria. Over $200 billion already in damages. The kind of decades of true international effort it's going to take to rebuild that up is just, it's overwhelming. And I think the world is, it's disconcerting right now. There's a lot happening, but how this plays into more people being food insecure and really disrupting markets and systems, it's going to take a long time to build that back. Yeah.
Good.
I would say USDA, we don't work in as many conflict zones as obviously USAID do. People who handle the acute hunger issues. We work a lot more in the development space. But you talked about food being used as a weapon. It is also used in sometimes, I think of our McGovern-Dole Food for Education program as a bit of an incentive as well.
Absolutely.
And that's been a really cool thing that I've witnessed in Laos and in Mozambique and other places. We go with our McGovern-Dole Food for Education program to countries where they've got greater than 25% stunting of their kids, and you've got a stable government. We try to get them to institute child nutrition programs in schools, school meal programs. And you can see it in kids, their eyes, their teeth, their hair is better. But when you also make sure that the young women are eligible for the exact same benefits as the boys, locals start sending their girls to school. And that plants the seeds for some gender equity issues and sort of begins to get at the issues that we talked about, trying to make sure that women have a role in agriculture and production around the globe. So that's one of the other sides of that coin that has been really fun for me to watch and very exciting, I think.
Yeah, good, thank you. By the way, I want to remind folks, the questions, write them down. Okay, I figured we had some. Well, keep it up if you don't mind so that our folks can come around and can weave them up into the front. So did you mention like 700 some million are go to bed hungry every night in the world? Is that 700?
Embedded in my brain.
So that's like more than 2 United States populations go to bed hungry every night in the world. That's insane. And I know the problems here locally too. In Ohio, it's like 1 out of every 5 Ohioans is food insecure as well. So it's you know, I hate that this exists, and I wanted to ask you both the question, can we have a world without hunger?
I believe we can. I mean, you look at the Sustainable Development Goals that 193 countries agreed to in September of last year, and they actually have a goal of ending hunger, not just reducing it, but ending hunger. And so the Zero Hunger Movement's another thing you can write down and look up, Sustainable Development Goals and Zero Hunger. In order for us to get there, it's going to take all these things that we've talked about. You can tell how complex it is. I mean, there's a lot of different layers here, and it's going to take a real international and true governance and government leadership to make this happen. But I absolutely believe it's possible, but we have to all kind of stay on track and stay focused in what kind of solutions will get us there.
Think about a long view. 30 or 40 years ago, it was mostly governments that were engaged in this effort. Now we've got Gates and Buffett foundations. People are really applying business principles and looking for very serious outcomes and these sorts of things. We look for serious outcomes at USDA as well, but it's wonderful to have a broader community of folks who are engaged in that. So I think there's reason for some very guarded optimism, but it ain't going to be easy.
If you had $1 million and you wanted to tackle the it's not going to be easy part of your response, where do you think you would want to go first?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, we have teams of people that try to prioritize and make sure that we apply our resources, our taxpayer resources, in ways that help fulfill a whole range of objectives. At USDA, we've got a lot of collaborative work with our land-grant university systems on, next generations of seeds and fertilizers and production methods and drip irrigation. We have people engaged in making trading systems more efficient and getting a handle on food loss and food waste. I don't know how, I would want to think about it longer before I divvy up $1 million.
I'll come back to it. We don't want to let you off. And I know, Kimberly, you would want to be advising the next president as well. I know CSIS likes to do that and create roadmaps. Anything jumps out at you right away where you would go first with your heaviest investment?
I think continuing to engage the private sector to keep us sustainable, and I also think focusing on policy analysis and enabling environments to make that happen is also critical.
Okay. We've got a question here around genetically modified crops. Will we need them to alleviate food insecurity?
Go ahead.
When it comes to agriculture in America or anywhere else, I'm sort of an all of the above kind of guy. USDA, we've got more certified organic producers in America than we've ever had. We just passed a benchmark last year. So I don't want to get bogged down in that GMO versus anti-GMO debate, other than to point out that we have never, as a society, said, "Oh, this part of science we're not going to participate in." So I think we need to keep as many options on the table as possible.
Okay.
And it's like anything else that's controversial. It takes a while for some public acceptance to accrue. But this kind of gets to a broader topic that I find a little interesting in American public life. You've got one section of the country, or one sort of folks that don't want to believe the science on climate change, and the other folks that don't want to believe the science on new technology in genetic modification, and we're talking past each other, and we need to get back to a scientific conversation on both of these things.
That's a great answer. On Tuesday, had a piece published in Forbes on this exactly, and the title was How Biotech Can Help Achieve Zero Hunger. So you can guess which side I lead on. It's very interesting in my circle of friends and my family. I'm a twice over Peace Corps volunteer, certified yoga teacher. I love shopping at farmers markets, and I am a pro-GMO advocate, and those don't always go together. But I'll tell you why I feel that way. I absolutely agree with Phil that it's one tool. It's not the tool. It's not the only tool, but it's one thing to consider as we need to increase yields. And my lens on this is not from the domestic angle. So a lot of the issues around whether it's monocropping or the pesticides or the monopoly, I'm looking at it from a global perspective. How can I help a smallholder farmer and help her increase her yield and increase her income to feed more people? And one way to do that is to have better seeds and inputs, or better inputs. And a genetically engineered seed, which everything that I have read, there's plenty of people that would agree. There's studies to show that it's not unsafe to us, or it is safe to use. But having a genetically engineered seed that can resist drought for the issues we're having right now, having a genetically engineered seed that can better withstand pest and disease, and having one that's actually nutritionally enhanced to add vitamin A when there's hundreds of thousands of children dying from vitamin A deficiency, that's what I care about. So I would never push the policy on a country until they would decide, but I do think it's one of the tools that is really necessary for us to be able to move forward to reach zero hunger.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the questions, by the way. I'm trying to figure out which ones to start with. Here's one. The United Nations recognizes the right to food as a matter of law. Not so the United States. Why not? What are the pros and cons of recognizing the right to food? And maybe if you know more about it, what does it mean to recognize the right of food as law?
I don't know. That's a tough one.
I don't claim to be an expert on everything the United Nations does. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a pass on that. Where
Okay.
I want to be cognizant of when we make proclamations in multilateral fora, though, is that we do it in a way that doesn't give rise to unintended consequences somewhere else. And so that's the frame from which I would explore that topic a little bit more. What does that mean? And does it mean that that countries, including our own, would be obligated to do things that we haven't thought about yet?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't have much to add. I mean, to me it is a right, but I haven't looked into or thought about why the U.S. government hasn't signed on to that, but I'm glad the UN has stated it.
Okay. Here's another question for you that gets to, I'll bring it up here more as a general concept, but as China grows and more countries build up their middle class, but China is the big one, they start wanting to eat more protein. Meat, soy, whatever. What kind of impact is that having on the global food system and agricultural system?
Well, China is a huge trading partner of ours in agricultural products, in large part because I think they've had a lot of economic change. They've got some headwinds right now, but and it does change our diet. When people have additional money, they often want to add protein, whether that's milk or cheese or eggs or meat. What does that mean for a global food system? I think there's for us, there's a lot of room for growth and opportunity for American agriculture. Part of the reason we have structured the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we really want to make sure that in that 40% of global GDP, we have rules of the road that make sense and that are transparent and rules-based and science-based. What does it portend for global food systems? I think it's hard for me to issue a blanket proclamation on that because, we have global food systems, but a lot of food systems are incredibly local too. So, the resources may shift under that scenario. I also read a statistic, I think, somewhere that, the demand for meat has quadrupled or quintupled in the last 30 years, but that's from an incredibly low base as well. So.
One thing I would add to that too is thinking about urbanization. And so, by 2050, 66% of populations are going to be living in urban centers. So, and you also have the aging issues of farming, both domestically and internationally. So you have younger people moving to the cities and moving away from agriculture. You have this increased demand of food supply, more of a demand of food, particularly around protein. So it's a lot of complicated added problems to already the bigger issue of population growth and other things. But I think urbanization is something that we really have to think about, particularly in our foreign assistance programs. We focus a lot, we meaning the US government, on rural populations, but I believe that needs to shift a bit as we think about cities and how we're going to deal with the food demand there.
Well, there's a couple questions to follow up to the protein demand issue and may relate to more industrialization as people living there eat more meat. There's two that kind of talk about a similar theme, which is the meat industry sustainable as the population grows? How significant of a difference would be made if we fed less resources to livestock? And the other similar question was, I understand that consumption of large amounts of meat has a much higher negative impact on water and land resources. If this is true, what should be done to limit animal consumption?
The only thing I'll add, that's not quite my area of expertise, so I won't say much, but it's true. I mean, it takes a lot more of a footprint or heavy footprint against the world, or however you might say that, as far as climate change concerns when we do eat meat. I believe Meatless Mondays, good idea. I'm not saying everyone should be a vegetarian, but I do think we have to think about consumer consumption and the role of the consumer when it comes to whether it's climate change impact or other things.
I would say you kind of hit the nail on the head there. A lot of this is going to come down to consumer choice, and I think that as a matter of public policy, we try not to make any more choices than necessary. I think that's sort of my default setting. And so people are going to choose whether or not they have Meatless Monday or what they do. But as people become aware of this, maybe they will choose to constrain. But I'm not sure that's the role I would want an official of USDA to be engaged in.
Got it. Well, let's talk about the food distribution system. And I wanted to ask a question because I've heard this before. Is there enough food right now to feed the world? Just start with that.
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Okay.
But we're talking a lot about food loss and food waste, so
exactly.
it doesn't quite get to where it needs to be for any variety of complex reasons.
So I was going to go to then this question about food distribution as distributing more efficiently as a possible solution to that. And it sounds like the food loss is also a big one.
Yeah.
Do either of you have any sense or thoughts on the distribution channels and the infrastructure that's needed?
We have to also think about infrastructure in there. And so a lot of the developing world in particular, you don't have the roads and the irrigation and things to help with that distribution problem. And so that's why transportation and electrification and things start to become much more relevant. I mean, there's also, of course, the post-harvest loss and food waste, but the infrastructure, transportation, all those elements, like moving those things along the value chain so that there is the distribution, is another element, which just goes back as a reminder of how complex this is and how it reaches so many different layers.
Having a power grid that works is incredibly important to cold chain management, and it's incredibly important to modern banking and moving money around. I would also say in WTO, the ministerial they had a couple of years ago that concluded in Bali, it gave a lot of attention to trade facilitation. How do we make borders work more appropriately so that you have predictable border arrangements? That's not in and of itself an answer to things, but it's the sort of thing that Community of Nations needs to be working on and will make a marginal contribution to a good flow of food across borders.
Got it. This is a follow-up to the border conversation, I think, because it talks about trade, and it's here's the question: is there a tension between helping people feed themselves, building local capacity, and feeding them through increased trade? And can global trade undermine local capacity? And how do we negotiate this tension?
I really don't. I don't see that tension. I look at it a little bit differently. You know, at the end of the Vietnam War, I think Vietnam was our 28th largest export market, and now they're number 7 or 8. And we see this building customers, building opportunities, helping them build value chains. We end up trading with each other over time. So there are a lot of evidence and a lot of cases where we've had an opportunity to helping someone else is also helping ourselves in many instances. So I don't see that. We work a lot with the World Health Initiative on soy, WISH, some of our soybean folks here, specifically on that premise. If you help create an opportunity where people utilize and start raising their own chicken somewhere, they may buy some soybeans. And so I think those two are very compatible, creating growth.
Thank you. More questions, just raise your hands. I know there's more out there and we can bring them up. Let's switch gears a little bit and think about individuals. So I remember growing up, I'd not want to eat all the food on my plate, and parents would say, oh, there's kids in, I think it was Ethiopia at the time, or China, that don't have much to eat your food. I'd be like, well, then just ship it to them, or something like that. And I'm trying to think of so I'm an individual, I'm, working every day in downtown Columbus, and, I have a family, and we busy during the week with everything we are busy with. What am I supposed to do about this? Or I care about it. Is there something that I can do without changing my career or joining the Peace Corps?
Well, your tax dollars are doing things about it. So that's one thing to think about. The U.S. government's doing a lot on this right now, and it's your tax dollars that are help making that happen. And I would just say, be informed. As you make decisions for the next political leader, whichever that is, whether that's local or the president, what do they care about and how that relates to you and what you care about, because the government is doing a lot on this. And that's my main thing, is I would say be informed and make your own decisions, about, again, consumer choice, what you're eating, trying to make your own, at least here in America, not wasting as much food and trying to buy enough only that you need to eat so you're not wasting it. Yeah.
She has my proxy on that one, 100%.
Okay. All right. All right. We'll switch to something else, which is, and when you talked about global food security, it's not just about having enough food, any kind of food, Twinkies or whatever. It depends. It's health and nutrition you mentioned. This question gets to that. If hunger can be taken as a health issue, what are we doing to bring in allies from the health industry?
Oh, can I take this one?
Sure.
This is one of my favorite topics for a lot of reasons. One is it's important to realize that hunger is the #1 health issue. There are more people that die from starvation or malnutrition deficiencies than there are from HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria combined. And a lot of people don't understand that. One thing that's really interesting about the Feed the Future initiative is the combination and integration of nutrition and agriculture. So finally, in the international development community, they're working on trying to combine these two once disparate sectors. Still a long way to go on that, but we're seeing a lot of progress and what can be done when you're combining nutrition elements with an agriculture type project. The other thing I want to emphasize is the first 1,000 days. So look that up too if you're taking notes. The first 1,000 days, which is there's a 1,000 days movement, you could call it. I actually was working detailed to Secretary Clinton when we launched this with the Irish government at the UN in 2010 or 11. I can't quite remember, but
we had their leader come and speak about a year ago.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah. They're great leaders in this issue particularly. But the first 1,000 days has to do from conception to the first 2 years of a child's life. And I learned a lot through this myself, but that time is so critical in a child's life because you can't reverse the damage that's done. And for a lot of government leaders, you've seen something called the SUN movement. Scaling up nutrition has been something a lot of global leaders have latched onto. And what they are realizing is this is what speaks more. The moral imperative doesn't always, but economic does. And so you can see a decline in economic growth and GDP from countries that aren't able to feed their children nutritious meals in the first 1,000 days, because that dietary diversity and what happens in the brain development during that time sticks with a child the rest of their life, and you can't reverse it. So you're going to see a decreased workforce and other intellectual capacity that isn't there because they don't get the kind of nutrition that they need during that critical window.
I see that in our McGovern-Dole Food for Education programs overseas.
Yeah.
You see kids that are getting some nutrition, and they are just happier, healthier, better teeth, better hair, better skin, and they're able to learn. And that makes an incredible difference in combating stunting. The other thing that we're working on, obviously we're facilitating a lot of conversations on the role of nutrition and getting the nutrition piece of it right. We do a couple of different things at USDA. We have Congress in the last Farm Bill gave us authority for something called local and regional procurement, so that when we go into poor countries, let's make it possible so that we can create some value chains. If there's a way to add bananas to the porridge or whatever, that we can sort of begin to build local support for these things so that someday they can graduate on and there will be an infrastructure and a value chain there to support these sort of nutrition programs. The other thing we've done, I think with a very modest amount of money on the nutrition front, we have had a conversation with micronutrients, a conversation about micronutrients that we funded, that Congress has funded through FAS.
What's a micronutrient?
A micronutrient are, I don't know what they all are,
okay,
but I know if kids get them in the right proportion, it reduces their likelihood of diarrhea or any other number of things that are real impediments to their learning. We did a cool project with Hormel in Minnesota where they went to, now I'm going to get the country wrong, somewhere in South America, and did a very comprehensive survey of what kind of micronutrients are lacking in kids. They did blood tests and cognitive tests before and after. They did blind tastings or blind tests with micronutrient products, and they found that by tweaking things just a little, it improved kids' cognitive abilities. It reduced their incidence of diarrhea and other sorts of things that are really detrimental to them. So that's sort of the stuff where we can leverage public and private collaboration together that is very exciting, and I hope we see more of that.
And one of the notes on the back of this question was, it goes beyond, sort of the physical health, talking about 60% more likely to experience depression and the role that nutrition and food has in that as well. Let me ask you this as we come to a close. You both are extremely gifted professionals who could be doing a lot of different things, making even more money, having whatever you want to be doing, but you choose to work in this field. And I'm curious, what is it about the work you're doing that drives you? Why are you spending your long days and brilliant minds on this issue?
Well, I'm excited to go to work every day. I've got a workforce and a group of colleagues that keep me energized and excited, and I've got a really cool staff at USDA. I grew up in a family, I think, that was sort of public-minded, so it's always, it's just what you did. I also know there's so much to work on, and that whatever skills a person has, there are ways to apply it to this basket of issues. So I don't know if I answered your question there.
Great.
Well, I talked about this a little bit with the high school students that we met with this morning. To me, you're only good at something if you're passionate about it, period. And so I think the reason I've been successful and that I like to think I'm good at my job is because I really care about it and it's meaningful to me. To me, there's a purpose, even though now I'm in an interesting position of criticizing and analyzing work I used to do. I really feel like I'm able to drive something forward, whether the next president, whoever he or she may be, listens to what I have to say with moving, what the policy roadmap should be on food security. I know that at least I'm doing analysis and research and thinking and writing on a topic that is really meaningful to me. And having spent 8 years in developing country, I've formed relationships with phenomenal people who do have limited resources, and I hope that the work that I do can just better guide the U.S. government to invest our dollars so that we're helping people.
Great. Those are great answers. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our distinguished speakers. Before you go, I do want you to know that our next program on February 11th will focus on China, U.S.-China relations. And one of the great things you may want to bring up is some of the things you learned today about China's role in the food industry. Ladies and gentlemen, we really thank you for being here. We are adjourned. Thanks.